April 3, 1943. Hereford, Texas. The train lurches to a stop in the middle of nowhere. 3,000 Italian soldiers step onto American soil for the first time. Dust swirls around their boots. The panhandle wind cuts through their tattered uniforms. They're exhausted, hungry, defeated. These men have traveled 8,000 miles from the deserts of North Africa, by ship through the Panama Canal, by rail across a continent they'd only heard about in stories, and now they stand in this flat, endless landscape that looks nothing like home. They're prisoners of war, the enemy. They expect harsh treatment, maybe labor camps, maybe worse. After all, their brothers are still fighting American soldiers in Italy. Their countrymen are dying under Allied bombs. They've heard what happens to prisoners. But then something strange happens. An American officer approaches. He doesn't raise his weapon. He doesn't shout. He welcomes them. Within weeks, these Italian prisoners will be eating the same food as American soldiers. Within months, they'll be working side by side with Texas farmers, sharing meals at their tables. Within a year, they'll be giving handmade jewelry to farmers' daughters, creating art, building friendships, and by war's end, they'll be calling their captors something they never expected. Friends. This is the untold story of how 3,000 enemy soldiers found paradise in the most unlikely place. How a small Texas town saved its economy through the labor of men they were supposed to hate, and how the bonds formed behind barbed wire would last for 50 years. This is the story of Camp Hereford, and it begins with a desperate need on both sides of that wire. To understand what happened in Hereford, you need to understand what was happening everywhere else. By early 1943, America had been at war for 16 months. Every able-bodied man was being drafted, trained, and shipped overseas. Small towns across the country were emptying out, and nowhere felt this more acutely than Texas. The Panhandle region, that flat, windswept expanse of farmland in the northern part of the state, was in crisis. Cotton needed picking, potatoes needed planting, carrots needed harvesting, grain elevators needed building, but there was nobody left to do the work. The same month those Italian prisoners arrived in Hereford, American boys from these very farms were storming beaches in North Africa, fighting in Sicily, dying in places their families couldn't pronounce. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Texas was sending its sons to capture enemy soldiers abroad, and those same enemy soldiers were being sent to Texas to fill the labor shortage the war had created. K.G. Feller, a volunteer at the Castro County Historical Museum, puts it simply, all the workforce was in the war, and they were happy to get strong workers to plant or till. Happy is probably an understatement. Desperate is more accurate, but first, the U.S. military had to build a place to hold them. In 1942, as the war intensified, military planners began scanning maps for suitable prisoner of war camp locations. They had specific criteria. The site needed to be isolated, far from major cities where prisoners might escape into a crowd. It needed to be inland, away from coasts where enemy submarines might somehow stage a rescue. And it needed to be flat and open, where an escaping prisoner could be spotted from miles away. Hereford, Texas was perfect. A town of just 2,300 people, located 45 miles southwest of Amarillo, surrounded by nothing but farmland and sky. You could see a man running from a mile away. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. In the latter half of 1942, hundreds of workers from across the Panhandle descended on two farmers' properties just outside town. They worked through the brutal summer heat and into fall, constructing what would become the second largest prisoner of war camp in the entire United States. The camp sprawled across 800 acres, 4 separate compounds, dozens of barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation areas, all surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fence, guard towers at every corner, armed sentries patrolling the perimeter. By the time construction finished in early 1943, Camp Hereford could hold up to 5,000 prisoners and required 750 American military personnel to run it. The locals watched it all with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride because their town was contributing to the war effort. Apprehension because, well, these were going to be enemy soldiers. Right here, in their backyard. Joe D. Rogers, a retired teacher who wrote his master's thesis about Camp Hereford, explains the mindset. The fact that the POW camp was here made a difference to the town, and the town made a difference to the Panhandle into the war effort. Everyone was doing their patriotic duty, but nobody quite knew what to expect. When the prisoners arrived, spring 1943, North Africa, while Camp Hereford was being built, a brutal campaign was unfolding 7,000 miles away. Allied forces were crushing the Axis powers in Tunisia. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was collapsing. Italian divisions were surrendering by the tens of thousands. On May 13, 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered completely. The Allies captured approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. It was a logistical nightmare. What do you do with 250,000 prisoners? You can't keep them in North Africa. You need every available resource to push into Sicily next. You can't send them to Britain. The island is already packed with Allied troops preparing for D-Day, so you send them to America. By the end of the war, the United States would hold more than 425,000 prisoners, 372,000 Germans, 51,000 Italians, and 5,000 Japanese. Texas alone would house approximately 80,000, of them in nearly 70 different camps. The first group to arrive at Camp Hereford came in April 1943. They were Italian soldiers captured during the North African campaign. They'd been loaded onto transport ships, sailed through the Panama Canal to the west coast, transferred to trains, and deposited in the Texas Panhandle. The journey took weeks. Most of these men had never been more than 100 miles from their villages in Italy. Now they were in America, in Texas, in a place so flat and foreign it might as well have been another planet. They stumbled off the trains, dirty and disoriented. They were marched on foot to the camp, processed, assigned barracks, issued prison camp identification, and then they waited to see what the Americans would do to them. What happened next shocked them completely. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for how prisoners of war must be treated, and America took those rules seriously. Prisoners had to be fed the same rations as the soldiers guarding them. They had to be housed in conditions equivalent to military barracks. They could be assigned work, but only non-military labor. They had to be paid. For the Italian prisoners at Camp Hereford, this meant something extraordinary. They ate what American soldiers ate. 3 meals a day: meat, vegetables, bread, coffee. Enlisted prisoners even got beer rations. Officers got wine. The portions were generous, more food than many of these men had seen in years of war. Remember, these soldiers came from an Italy ravaged by conflict. Food had been scarce. Rations had been cut repeatedly. Many of them had been slowly starving in North Africa. Now, as prisoners in enemy hands, they were eating better than they had as free men fighting for their own country. One Italian prisoner would later write home, "We are treated like human beings here. We have food. We have beds. We have time to rest. This is not what we expected." But it wasn't just the food. The barracks were heated in winter. There was running water, medical care, recreation facilities. The prisoners could play soccer, bocce ball. They were given musical instruments, art supplies. They could take college courses taught by fellow prisoners who had been teachers before the war. The camp had a canteen where prisoners could spend their earnings. Because yes, they were paid 80 cents per day. The money came in the form of camp scrip, vouchers that could only be used at the camp store, preventing prisoners from accumulating cash for an escape. With their earnings, they could buy cigarettes, candy bars, writing materials, toiletries, and other personal items. 80 cents doesn't sound like much, but in 1943 that was real money. An American private earned $50 a month. A prisoner could earn $24 a month. For men who had nothing, it was a fortune, and they could send letters home. Initially, the U.S. military limited how many letters prisoners could send, maybe 2 a month. But by February 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final phase, restrictions were lifted completely. Joe D. Rogers explains why. What they're writing is, "You need to go to the Americans. This is how we're being treated. This is what I'm eating." They influenced hundreds, if not thousands, of combatants to surrender rather than fight to the death. It was strategic, psychological warfare through kindness. If word spread that American captivity meant safety, food, and fair treatment, more Axis soldiers might choose surrender over suicidal last stands. But there was something else happening. something the military planners hadn't fully anticipated. The prisoners and the local Texans were starting to see each other as human beings. September 8, 1943. Italy surrendered to the Allies. The news reached Camp Hereford like a shockwave. Italian Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio issued a statement instructing all Italian prisoners of war to cooperate with the Allied forces. Italy was switching sides. The prisoners faced an impossible choice. They could collaborate with the Allies, essentially joining the people who had defeated them. This meant accepting relaxed security, better treatment, and the possibility of meaningful work outside the camp. Thousands of Italian prisoners across America chose this option, volunteering for what became known as Italian service units. They wore modified uniforms with ISU insignia and worked at military depots, ports, hospitals, and farms across the country. Or they could refuse. They could remain loyal to Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. They could say no to collaboration. At Camp Hereford, most refused. Joe D. Rogers is blunt about who ended up there. Most of them out here were the ardent fascists. They were sorted out from the rest of the Italians all over the United States and brought to Hereford. Think about that. Camp Hereford became a collection point for the most committed fascist soldiers, the diehards who wouldn't bend, wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't give in. These weren't political zealots or SS-style fanatics. They were soldiers who believed in honor, in not betraying their oath, in not switching sides just because the war was going badly. So Hereford held the hardliners, the non-collaborators, the prisoners who, by all logic, should have been the most hostile, the most dangerous, the most difficult. And yet, by 1944, farmers from across the Panhandle were hiring these ardent fascists to work their fields. The U.S. military and local authorities had worked out a system that complied with Geneva Convention rules about prisoner labor. Willing prisoners could be hired for agricultural work, planting potatoes, harvesting carrots, picking cotton, even pouring concrete for massive grain elevators. The farmers paid the military 45 cents per hour per laborer. The prisoners kept their 80 cents per day wage. Everyone benefited. But more importantly, something remarkable was happening in those fields. Italian prisoners and Texas farmers were working side by side, sharing water, sharing tools, eventually sharing meals. These farmers had sons fighting overseas. Some had sons fighting in Italy, literally battling other Italian soldiers. And yet here they were, sitting down to lunch with Italian prisoners, passing bread, talking about crops. The prisoners were grateful for the work. It beat sitting in barracks all day. It gave them purpose, and working the land felt familiar. Many of them came from farming families back in Italy. The farmers were grateful for the labor. Their crops weren't rotting in the fields. Their farms weren't going under. The war effort was being fed. K.G. Feller from the Castro County Historical Museum explains it. They didn't have to like them. But as they worked together, that's when all the relationships were built. Work became the bridge. Shared labor created mutual respect. And respect created something nobody expected: friendship. But the Italians gave the community something else too, something that went beyond labor. They gave them art. In their spare time, the prisoners at Camp Hereford created. They painted landscapes of the Panhandle, those endless horizons and big skies that reminded them of home. They painted portraits of local women. They hammered scrap metal from farmers' junk piles into toy airplanes. They took coins and crafted them into delicate rings which they gave to farmers' daughters. They built furniture from wood. They carved violins that actually played. They wrote music. They performed plays and musicals in the camp theater. These weren't just prisoners killing time. These were artists separated from their families, pouring their homesickness and hope into their work. In August 1945, after Japan surrendered and the war officially ended, the prisoners held a public art exhibition in one of the empty barracks. Local residents came to see paintings, sculptures, and handcrafts created by enemy soldiers. One visitor was Reverend John Cruckert, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church in the tiny town of Umbarger, about halfway between Hereford and Amarillo. Father Cruckert walked through that exhibition and saw something extraordinary: real talent, deep faith, and an opportunity. St. Mary's Church had bare white walls inside. The sanctuary was plain, uninspiring. Cruckert had long dreamed of decorating it, but the parish was poor and rural. There was no money for professional artists, but here, in a prisoner of war camp, were trained Italian artists with nothing but time. Crooked approached the camp's Catholic chaplain with an idea. What if some of the prisoners could paint murals inside St. Mary's? In exchange, the women of the church would provide home-cooked Italian meals, real food, prepared the way their mothers would have made it. Permission was granted. Security arrangements were made, and 9 Italian prisoners, led by a 24-year-old captain named Franco Di Bello, were transported to Umbarger to begin work. Franco Di Bello was an interesting choice to lead the project. He spoke perfect English. He was educated, and crucially, he was one of the fascist non-collaborators, a man who had refused to join the Italian service units because he wouldn't break his oath to Italy. But he was also deeply Catholic. And he was an exceptional artist. For weeks, Di Bello and his team of prisoner artists worked inside St. Mary's Church. They painted massive murals depicting scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, the Annunciation, the moment the angel Gabriel told Mary she would give birth to Jesus, the Visitation, Mary's visit to her cousin Elizabeth, the Assumption, Mary being taken up into heaven. In the backgrounds of these religious scenes, the artists painted landscapes, not of biblical Judea, not of Italy, of Texas. The murals showed farmhouses and fields of harvest-ready wheat, the landscapes these prisoners saw every day outside the church. They were painting their temporary home into sacred art, blending the divine with the very real place they found, themselves. 2 woodcarvers among the prisoners created a detailed bas-relief carving of the Last Supper for the front of the altar. The work was meticulous, reverent, stunning. The women of the parish kept their end of the bargain. They cooked pasta the way Italian mothers cooked it. They made sauce from scratch. They brought these enemy soldiers into their homes and fed them at their tables. Think about that moment. German and Italian forces were still fighting Allied soldiers in Europe. The war was barely over, and here in rural Texas, American women were cooking Italian food for Italian prisoners, welcoming them as guests. By the time the St. Mary's project was finished, something had fundamentally shifted. The prisoners weren't just laborers anymore. They weren't just artists, they were part of the community. But of course nothing lasts forever, especially not in wartime. February 1946. The war had been over for 6 months. Across America, prisoner of war camps were emptying. Soldiers were being repatriated. Ships were carrying thousands of Germans, Italians, and Japanese back to their devastated homelands. At Camp Hereford, the final prisoners were preparing to leave. For many, the emotion was complicated. They wanted to go home. They'd been separated from families for years. They didn't know if their parents, wives, or children had survived the war, but they were leaving a place where they'd been safe, fed, treated with dignity, where they'd made friends. The contrast between what they were leaving and what they were returning to was stark. Italy in 1946 was destroyed. Cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Food was scarce. Jobs were non-existent. The infrastructure was shattered. Millions were displaced. Famine threatened. America, even the small rural towns of the Texas Panhandle, looked like paradise by comparison. Some prisoners asked if they could stay. The answer was no. Geneva Convention rules were clear. Prisoners had to be repatriated, but what happened next was extraordinary. And it took decades to unfold. The prisoners left. But they didn't forget. They wrote letters. For years, for decades, to the farmers they'd worked alongside, to the families who'd shared meals with them, to Father Crooked at St. Mary's, to the guards who'd treated them fairly. The letters came from Italy, from small villages rebuilt stone by stone, from cities rising from ruins, from men trying to rebuild their lives, and the Texans wrote back. Farmers sent packages, care parcels with food, clothes, and supplies. Families exchanged photographs. Former prisoners sent pictures of their children. The Texans sent pictures of their grandchildren. Friendships forged behind barbed wire survived the war, survived the distance, survived the transformation of former enemies into somehow friends. But there was something else these former prisoners left behind, something that would outlast all of them: a chapel. During their time at Camp Hereford, 5 Italian prisoners died. They didn't die from mistreatment. They died from disease, accidents, and natural causes. But they died far from home in a foreign land, buried in foreign soil. Their fellow prisoners wanted to honor them, to create something permanent, something that would say, "We were here. We remember." So they built a chapel. Using materials they could scrounge, wood, concrete, metal, the prisoners constructed a small white chapel on the campgrounds. It wasn't elaborate. It wasn't grand. But it was theirs. They engraved words into the floor in Italian. From the Italian prisoners to the companions who will not return. After the prisoners left and Camp Hereford was decommissioned, most of the camp was torn down. The barracks were demolished. The mess halls were destroyed. The guard towers came down. The fences were pulled up, but the chapel remained. For decades it stood alone in a cornfield, a small white structure amid the stalks, wind-worn, sun-bleached, slowly deteriorating. Local residents maintained it as best they could. They understood what it represented, not just the Italian prisoners who built it, but something larger, a moment when enemies became human beings to each other, when captivity became cooperation, when war created against all odds friendship. Then in 1988 something remarkable happened. Buses rolled into Hereford, filled with elderly men wearing suits and ties. Some wore Italian military medals pinned to their chests. They were former prisoners returning to see the place that had defined years of their lives. It was a reunion. Former prisoners and former guards. Former prisoners and the farmers they'd worked for. Former prisoners and the children of families who'd befriended them 45 years earlier. They walked to the chapel together. They entered in small groups, running their hands over the walls they'd built, reading the inscription they'd carved, crying. Then they stepped outside and embraced their hosts, the American enemy, their friends. These reunions continued through the 1990s. Former prisoners made pilgrimages back to Texas. Some brought their children, their grandchildren. They wanted their families to see this place, to understand this story. Many spoke about how their time at Camp Hereford had changed them, how being treated with dignity by their enemies had taught them something profound about humanity, about how even in war decency can survive. One former prisoner speaking at a reunion said through tears, "We came as enemies. We left as friends. That should not have been possible, but it was." Today, the Italian POW chapel outside Hereford still stands. It's one of the few remaining structures from any World War II prisoner of war camp in the United States. It's been restored multiple times. Listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Maintained by local volunteers who never knew the prisoners but understand the importance of memory. Inside St. Mary's Church in Umbarger, the murals painted by Franco di Bello and his fellow prisoners are still there. The colors have been restored, but the work is original, 78 years later. Those fields of Texas wheat and those scenes of divine grace still cover the sanctuary walls. Tourists visit. Historians study it. But mostly it's still a working church. Families in Umbarger still worship beneath art created by enemy soldiers in 1945. The grain elevators poured by Italian prisoners still stand across the panhandle. The fields they planted still produce crops. The friendships they built produced decades of correspondence, multiple reunions, and a legacy that outlived most of them. Camp Hereford was just one camp. The Italian prisoners there were just 3,000 men among 51,000 Italians imprisoned in America during World War II. Among 425,000 total prisoners. Among millions of soldiers who fought in that war. But what happened there matters, because it shows us something we need to remember. Even in the middle of total war, when nations are trying to destroy each other, when propaganda dehumanizes the enemy, when every instinct screams for revenge, even then, ordinary people can choose humanity. The farmers of the Texas Panhandle didn't have to treat Italian prisoners with kindness. They could have seen them only as the enemy, only as the people killing their sons overseas, only as free labor to be exploited. The prisoners didn't have to respond with gratitude and friendship. They could have remained bitter, hostile, planning escape or resistance. But both sides made different choices. The Americans chose to follow the Geneva Convention not just in letter but in spirit. To feed prisoners well, to pay them fairly, to allow them dignity, purpose, and creative expression. The Italians chose to work hard, to contribute, to create art, and to build relationships with their captors, and those choices created something that lasted 80 years and counting. There's a broader lesson here about the nature of conflict and reconciliation, about how enemies can become allies, about how the distance between hatred and friendship can be crossed by simple acts of decency. After World War II, America helped rebuild the nations it had fought, including Italy and Germany. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into reconstruction. Former enemies became close allies. Within a generation, American soldiers would be stationed in Italy and Germany as defenders, not conquerors. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because even during the war, people on both sides had maintained their humanity, had seen each other as human beings worth treating well. Camp Hereford was a small piece of that larger story. Today, if you drive through the Texas Panhandle, you can still visit the Italian POW chapel. It sits in a cornfield outside Hereford, surrounded by the same flat landscape those prisoners saw in 1943. You can walk inside, read the inscription, touch the walls built by men who were technically enemies of America, but who left as friends. You can drive to Umbarger and see St. Mary's Church. Walk into that sanctuary and look up at murals painted by prisoners of war. See Texas wheat fields rendered in the background of sacred scenes. See art that bridges nations and time. And if you look closely, if you really pay attention, you can see something else. You can see proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, kindness is possible. That even when nations are at war, individuals can choose friendship. That even behind barbed wire, dignity can survive. The Italian prisoners who landed in Texas in 1943 couldn't believe Americans called them friends. But by the time they left, they understood. Because friendship isn't about never being enemies. It's about choosing connection over hatred. It's about recognizing the humanity in the person across from you, even when everything tells you not to. The story of Camp Hereford is about war. But more importantly, it's about peace. Not the peace that comes after war ends. The peace that can exist even while war rages. The peace two people can make, working side by side in a field, sharing a meal, creating something beautiful. That kind of peace doesn't end wars, but it does something equally important. It reminds us that even in war, we don't have to lose our humanity, that treating others with dignity isn't weakness, that the distance between enemy and friend is shorter than we think, and sometimes, against all odds, in the middle of the Texas Panhandle, that distance can be crossed completely. 80 years after those first Italian prisoners stepped off trains in Hereford, their chapel still stands. Their art still inspires. Their story still teaches, because some friendships transcend war. Some kindness outlasts conflict, and some stories once forgotten deserve to be remembered. This is one of them.